imagine sitting in a clinical, really brightly lit doctor's office, and you are describing these symptoms that have been just terrifying you for weeks,
Right.
like an intense burning heat localized right at the base of your spine, spontaneous muscular locks that you can't control, and this rushing sensation traveling up into your skull, accompanied by internal ringing.
Yeah. And if you told a doctor that today, you would almost certainly walk out of that office with a heavy psychiatric diagnosis, probably a prescription too.
Exactly. But what if you weren't actually losing your mind? What if instead your biology was actively triggering this ancient, pre-installed software upgrade?
And what's fascinating here is that this is the exact premise we are dissecting today. Because the sources we've piled up on the table for this deep dive, they cross boundaries that usually never interact.
Yeah, we're talking wildly different fields.
Completely. We are looking at ancient Taoist alchemical texts, esoteric Christian physiology, clinical psychiatry studies, and highly advanced neurobiology. And our mission is to find the overlap. We are investigating whether mystical concepts, things like, Kundalini awakenings, the immortal fetus, or the sacred secretion, are actually literal, measurable biological processes.
Processes that modern science has really only just recently developed the tools to observe.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I want you, the listener, to set aside the idea that enlightenment is just some vague, peaceful psychological state. Think of it more as a literal physical rewiring of human biology.
A hidden capability in your hardware, essentially, waiting for the right sequence of inputs.
Right. We are attempting to bridge these Eastern esoteric traditions with modern fluid dynamics and cellular metabolism. But to do that, to talk about reaching some higher state of consciousness, we first have to talk about how the brain cleans house.
You have to take out the trash first.
Exactly. If you want to run a massive neurological upgrade, the foundational maintenance of the brain is just, well, it's mandatory.
It is. And the wild thing is, until 2012, medical science didn't even fully understand how the brain cleared its metabolic waste. That's when researchers discovered the glymphatic system.
Which is basically a highly specialized brain-wide plumbing network, right?
Precisely. It relies on a specific type of glial cell called an astrocyte. And these astrocytes, they essentially wrap around the blood vessels in the brain, forming this outer sheath. Through these tiny water channels called aquaporin 4, these cells pump cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, deep into the dense tissue of the brain.
And the purpose of pumping that fluid is to act as like a cellular street sweeper, because every single time a neuron fires, it creates a chemical byproduct.
Right, metabolic waste.
Yeah, and one of the major ones is amyloid beta. That's the protein famous for accumulating into plaques in Alzheimer's patients. So the lymphatic system's job is to physically wash that toxic buildup out of the interstitial spaces between the brain cells and, flush it into the body's lymphatic system for disposal.
The mechanism is elegant, but there is a major physiological hurdle here. The system is almost entirely shut down while you are awake.
So it's literally like a city street sweepers. I mean, they can't effectively clean the roads at noon on a Tuesday because the streets are completely jammed with commuter traffic.
Exactly.
They have to wait until like 3:00 a.m. when the streets are empty to really blast the asphalt. So in the human brain, what is that daytime traffic?
The traffic is norepinephrine. It's a neurotransmitter that drives arousal, alertness, and our basic waking state. So when your brain is bathed in norepinephrine during the day, the interstitial spaces in your brain tissue are physically contracted.
Wait, the tissue itself is tight.
Yes, the tissue is tight. This high resistance completely blocks the flow of that cleansing cerebrospinal fluid. But when you fall into deep, slow-wave sleep, your norepinephrine levels just plummet.
Causing the tissue to relax.
More than relax, the spaces between your brain cells physically expand by up to 60%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which allows the CSF to just rush in and wash the tissue.
Okay, but I am stuck on a contradiction here. If this crucial flushing mechanism only operates when we are unconscious, like in deep sleep, how do practicing monks and mystics achieve these supposedly clean, elevated states? I mean, are they just taking incredibly profound, spiritually enlightened naps?
It's a fair question, but the data points to something far more active. Meditation actually acts as a physiological hack to bypass that wakeful block.
How so?
Well, when practitioners engage in focused attention meditation, so holding unyielding focus on a single point or their breath, they are actively suppressing their norepinephrine output while maintaining conscious awareness.
Oh, I see.
And simultaneously, they generate slow-wave delta brain activity, which typically only registers during the absolute deepest phases of unconscious sleep.
So they are essentially tricking their own nervous system.
Yeah.
They convince the brain it's asleep, so the street sweepers deploy, but they somehow keep the lights of consciousness turned on.
We actually have compelling neuroimaging to back this up, too. Neuroscientist David Vago conducted this really fascinating study on adept meditators. We're talking individuals with roughly 2,100 hours of meditation practice.
Which, to put that in perspective for you guys listening, that's about 4 hours a week over 10 years. That is a lot of sitting.
It's a massive commitment. And Vago's team used advanced MRI techniques and found something remarkable. During meditation, these subjects exhibited a decrease in the raw volume of fluid moving through the cerebral aqueduct. But there's a catch.
Yes. They showed a massive increase in the rhythmic flow of fluid in the fourth ventricle and the spaces around the spine.
The rhythmic pacing is the key there, isn't it? Cool. It is. The rhythm locked in at a very specific frequency, between 0.05 and 0.08 hertz. And that frequency mimics the exact fluid dynamic conditions observed in humans during deep sleep.
Yet these subjects were sitting upright, fully awake, and actively processing their environment.
Exactly. And the sources also suggest this isn't exclusively locked behind a decade of monastic training. Certain acoustic therapies, like immersive sound meditation using low-frequency binaural beats, can actually artificially induce these slow delta waves.
Essentially jump-starting the lymphatic clearance from the outside.
Right.
Okay, so if you are engaging in that level of cellular cleanup and altering the physical state of the brain while awake, that has to require a massive amount of physical energy. The brain is already this notoriously energy-hungry organ. Where's the body getting the kind of fuel to power this upgraded pump?
To answer that, we have to transition from fluid dynamics to bioenergetics, because maintaining these synchronized, heightened states of consciousness demands cellular energy on just an enormous scale.
Right.
In human biology, all energy boils down to one molecule, which is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Under normal day-to-day conditions, our bodies primarily run on glucose. The process is called glycolysis. The cell breaks down a glucose molecule in its cytoplasm to generate energy.
Which is fast.
Incredibly fast. And it doesn't require oxygen, which is great for, say, a quick sprint, but it is staggeringly inefficient. It yields a net of only 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule.
So glycolysis is kind of like throwing a handful of dry pine needles and twigs onto a fire. It flares up incredibly bright, burns hot for a few seconds, gives you a quick spike, and then dies out completely.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
And you are left constantly feeding the fire just to keep it alive. That's the classic sugar spike and crash.
The alternative is shifting the body's metabolic engine into the mitochondria and utilizing oxygen to perform beta oxidation, which is the burning of fatty acids.
Okay.
A single molecule of a fatty acid, like palmitate, for example, runs through this mitochondrial pathway and yields over 100 molecules of ATP.
Wait, from 2 ATP up to over 100?
Yes. The power output is exponential compared to glucose.
Going back to the fire analogy, beta oxidation is like taking a dense, heavy oak log and placing it in the hearth. It takes much more oxygen and effort to get it to catch, but once it is burning, it emits massive, sustained heat for hours without needing to be restocked.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on that word heat for a second. Is the energy generated from 100 ATP molecules purely like microscopic chemical energy? Or does it translate into tangible physical heat in the body?
It translates into very real, measurable thermal output. This metabolic shift creates what physiologists call metabolic flexibility. The body can sustain massive neurological demands without crashing.
Oh, wow.
And in certain advanced practices, this dense mitochondrial fire produces literal heat. Consider the Tamil monks in the Himalayas.
Oh, I've heard of them.
They utilize a highly specific technique called vase breath, which alters the pressure in their lower abdomen and maximizes oxygenation. In freezing, sub-zero environments, they can raise their peripheral body temperature by over 8 degrees Celsius.
That is insane.
They sit draped in freezing wet sheets, and the heat radiating from their skin literally dries the sheets and melts the snow in a circle around them.
That is just stunning to picture. A human body radiating enough excess metabolic energy to literally melt snow in the Himalayas.
And when we view this through the lens of traditional Chinese medicine, it perfectly maps onto the ancient Taoist concept of the three treasures, which are Jing, Qi, and Shen.
Okay, how so?
Well, these texts have been describing cellular respiration for centuries, just using different terminology. Jing is the foundational essence. Biologically, Jing represents your dense physical reserves, so your DNA integrity, your hormonal balance, and those dense fatty acids waiting to be burned.
The heavy oak log.
Yes, the oak log. The second treasure is qi, translating to vital energy or breath. In our biological framework, qi is the metabolic vapor. It is the literal influx of oxygen combining with the jing to create that massive 100 ATP output.
Makes perfect sense.
And finally, there is shen, the spirit or mind. Biologically, shen corresponds to the resulting neuroelectromagnetic light. It's the highly synchronized, sustained brainwave activity powered by that ATP engine.
So when a Taoist alchemical text describes the sacred process of refining Jing into Qi and Qi into Shen, they are providing a literal manual for optimizing your metabolic pathways to fuel a higher state of consciousness.
Precisely.
So the body is quite literally an engine designed to refine dense physical matter into neuroelectrical light. But if you were generating this massive metabolic fire, this Qi, where did that energy go? Like, how does it physically travel from the lower abdomen to the brain?
This requires looking at the physics of Kundalini. Ancient yogic texts describe Kundalini as a dormant, coiled serpent at the base of the spine.
Right, very famous imagery.
And when awakened, this intense energy rushes up the spinal column to pierce the brain. Now, in the late 1970s, a biomedical engineer named Itzhak Bentov sought to explain this physically. He developed a biomechanical model known as the Physio-Kundalini syndrome.
Wait, hold on. I'm having a hard time picturing this. Because we don't have empty tubes in our backs for energy to rush through. If we're looking for literal biology, what is physically moving in Bentov's model?
It's a great question. Bentov tracked the cardiovascular system. He proposed that when a practitioner enters deep meditation, their breathing and heart rate lock into a highly stable rhythm.
Okay.
As the heart beats, the pulse of blood descends through the aorta. Deep in the lower abdomen, down at the pelvis, the aorta hits a bifurcation. It splits into the iliac arteries to feed the legs.
Right.
Bentham argued that in this deeply relaxed state, the pulse of blood hits that fork in the road and actually bounces back up.
Oh, it creates a rebound effect.
Correct.
Yeah.
The continuous descending pulses meet the rebounding pulses, creating an acoustic standing wave. So it's a physical oscillation vibrating up and down the length of the spine.
So the blood is literally acting as an acoustic tuning fork.
Yes. And this acoustic wave travels up the spinal column and induces a literal micromotion in the skull. The skull begins to vibrate at a microscopic level, which in turn vibrates the cerebrospinal fluid.
The same fluid we talked about earlier.
The very same. The fluid creates its own standing waves within the hollow ventricles of the brain. Those fluid waves mechanically stimulate the sensory and motor cortex, sparking an electrical loop that travels continuously around the cerebral hemispheres.
Okay, that makes mechanical sense, but I have a major reservation here.
Go ahead.
If you look at the documented symptoms of a Kundalini awakening, intense localized heat, spontaneous, uncontrollable muscle spasms, feeling an overwhelming electrical current rushing up your spine, and even hearing internal acoustic ringing.
It's intense.
It sounds incredibly disorienting. If someone walked into an emergency room describing an internal voice and a vibrating skull, modern psychiatry would almost certainly diagnose them with a psychotic break. So how do we know this entire phenomenon isn't just a romanticized form of mental illness?
That exact skepticism drove Dr. Bruce Grayson, a prominent psychiatrist, to conduct a clinical study. He wanted to see if the Physio-Kundalini syndrome was distinguishable from clinical psychosis.
And how did he do that?
He used a diagnostic tool called the 19-item Physio-Kundalini Syndrome Index. This index tracks specific markers like spontaneous changes in breathing, temperature extremes, and altered states of awareness.
Okay.
And he administered it to 3 distinct groups: people who had experienced near-death experiences, normal control subjects, and psychiatric patients, including those with diagnosed psychoses and schizophrenia.
Well, if Kundalini is just a mystical term for a psychotic break, the psychiatric patients should score off the charts on those symptoms.
You would think so, but the data showed the exact opposite. The near-death experiencers reported a mean of 7.6 Physio-Kundalini symptoms.
Out of 19.
Right. But the psychotic patients reported a mean of only 3.2 symptoms. In fact, the psychiatric patients scored lower than the normal healthy control group, who averaged a 4.6.
Wait, really? So the people experiencing active clinical psychosis were actually the least likely to present these specific physical symptoms?
Exactly. The study clearly demonstrated that the mechanics of Kundalini are highly distinct from mental illness. Symptoms like ascending thermal sensations up the spine, specific muscular locks, and achieving witness consciousness.
What's witness consciousness?
It's a state where you observe your own thoughts without attachment. These are physiological milestones of a neurobiological event. They do not correlate with the disorganized thought patterns of pathology.
Okay, so if this mechanical electrical loop successfully travels up the spine and reaches the top, what is the ultimate destination? We've tracked the metabolic fuel from the cells and the acoustic waves off the aorta. What actually physically happens in the brain when this supposed enlightenment is achieved?
To understand the destination, we can look at esoteric Christianity, specifically the theories of George W. Carey. Carey focused on the concept of the sacred secretion, or the Christ seed.
I've heard that term before.
He posited that a refined bodily substance travels down the spinal cord to the solar plexus. According to Carey, it incubates there for 2.5 days, synchronized with the lunar cycle.
I need to interrupt again because incubating a seed for 2.5 days sounds exactly like the kind of poetic metaphor we are trying to avoid. How does that actually translate to human anatomy?
It sounds metaphorical, but look at the biology. The solar plexus is part of the enteric nervous system, which is the complex network of neurons in our gut, heavily governed by the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve being the biological superhighway connecting the gut biome directly to the brain.
Precisely. And the 2.5 days aligns with the approximate duration of a full metabolic and circadian transit cycle in the human body.
Okay.
The esoteric claim is that if this physical energy, this neurochemical potential, isn't depleted by chronic stress, poor diet, or overexertion, it is conserved. It travels back up the vagus nerve pathway, crosses the base of the skull, and activates the pineal and pituitary glands.
But the two glands sitting basically right in the center of the brain.
Yes. In esoteric texts, this region is often called the biblical land of milk and honey. The milk refers to the secretions of the pineal gland, and the honey refers to the pituitary.
Interesting.
When this ascending neural loop stimulates these glands, it triggers a cascade that awakens dormant brain centers. And we can physically observe the result of this awakening by looking at the EEG readings of advanced practitioners.
You're talking about the extremes of the human brainwave spectrum.
Yes. When neurologists map the brainwaves of individuals who report hitting these unified states, they see the brain operating at its absolute outer limits. On the lower end, you find epsilon waves.
Those are very slow, right?
Incredibly slow, registering under 0.5 hertz. Biologically, epsilon waves are associated with suspended animation, profound stillness, and the deepest yogic trances known as samadhi.
But they aren't just sitting in a coma, because there is a second paradoxical wave happening simultaneously.
Right. At the exact same time, their brains are generating lambda waves. These waves fire at around 200 hertz, which is a staggering rate of neural processing.
200 hertz. That's massive.
It is. Lambda waves correlate with profound flashes of insight, ecstatic oneness, and total integration of the brain's hemispheres.
How is it physically possible to operate at a near zero frequency and a 200 hertz frequency in the exact same moment? I keep picturing a spinning tire on a car driving down the highway.
Okay, I like that.
The lambda wave is the processing speed. The tire is spinning so incredibly fast, generating so much raw kinetic energy that when you look at the hubcap with the naked eye, it appears to be perfectly peacefully still.
That's a brilliant visual.
That visual illusion of absolute stillness is the epsilon wave. The highest possible vibration creates a state of total motionless peace.
Building on that exact metaphor, maintaining that speed without the tire tearing itself apart requires an entirely new, reinforced chassis. That is the biological goal the Taoists referred to as the immortal fetus.
The immortal fetus.
It sounds incredibly esoteric, but if we ground it in what we've discussed, they were talking about birthing a new locus of consciousness. They were using the massive ATP generation, the synchronized fluid dynamics, and the vagal nerve stimulation to build a self-sustaining neural network within the body.
A fetus that exists in that high-speed, perfect stillness state permanently.
Exactly.
You know, the famous psychologist Carl Jung wrote extensively about this exact Taoist concept, didn't he? He studied the text called The Secret of the Golden Flower.
He did, and his interpretation is actually a perfect example of where Western science often stumbles. Jung was fascinated by the immortal fetus and the alchemy of turning base lead into gold.
Right.
He mapped these concepts directly onto his psychological theory of individuation, which is the process of taking the fractured, traumatized human ego and integrating it into a whole, healthy self.
but he viewed it entirely as a psychological exercise.
He suffered deeply from, this very Western mind-body dualism. Jung reduced the golden flower to a beautiful, elaborate metaphor for mental health. He completely missed the intense, literal, physical reality the Taoists were documenting.
He ignored the standing acoustic waves bouncing off the aorta.
And the cerebrospinal fluid washing out the amyloid beta, and the massive cellular heat generation. To the ancient alchemists, this was never just therapy, it was a literal, directed biological mutation.
They were systematically using the physical body as a crucible to change the state of human matter. That completely reframes how we should view our own biology.
How so?
I mean, your body is not just a meat vehicle designed to drag your brain from your bed to your office and back again. It is a highly evolved, latent, alchemical reactor. The practices we casually lump into self-care and, protecting our deep, slow-wave sleep, practicing rhythmic breathing, engaging in focused meditation, they aren't just ways to de-stress.
No, not at all.
They are the literal activation codes for your neurobiology. They are the keystrokes required to run the software update.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final piece of the puzzle. We now know, as a matter of peer-reviewed science, that the glymphatic system actively washes the brain in a specialized fluid, clearing the way for higher function.
Right.
We also know that ancient scriptures describe a sacred oil or a water of life ascending the spine to anoint the mind and bring illumination. It begs an enormous question.
What's that?
Could the newly discovered glymphatic system literally be the biblical river of life? What if these ancient mystical texts aren't full of poetic religious allegories at all? What if they are actually a highly technical, step-by-step anatomical manuals just waiting for us to translate them back into the language of modern biology?
That is exactly the kind of question that shifts a paradigm. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. The next time you sit down to breathe, or finally catch a deep night of slow-wave sleep, remember that the enlightenment you are looking for might not be floating in the clouds. It might be a hidden upgrade waiting right inside your own cells. Keep questioning the world around you.